Good. All right. So welcome in, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is John Lacey, and I'll be your host. I work for the University of Tennessee System, and I'm one of the organizers of the Pandemic to Possibility webinar series. To get us warmed up this afternoon, if everyone could take a second and type in the chat window the type of industry or sector you work in or represent, we'll let our presenters look through your responses to get a feel for the variety of industries that are with us here today. Today, we are presenting the economic, fiscal, financial consequences of COVID-19, a panel discussion. And here's what you can expect from us today. This session has really been designed to provide you with information related to the implications of COVID-19 for major indicators like gross domestic product, business investment, personal income, jobs, and the unemployment rate in Tennessee and beyond, the impacts on farm prices, production, sales, and exports, the consequences for federal, state, and local government finances, the alphabet soup of possible recovery trajectories, and the interconnections between COVID-19, public health, and economic performance. But just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat box in your Zoom control panel, and myself or someone on our team will bring them up during the Q&A portion of the session following the presentations. And we are recording this session, so everyone is on mute right now, but we'll unmute everybody at the end for the Q&A portion in case you'd prefer to verbalize your question. And of course, we expect everyone to follow a code of conduct that has been outlined on our webinar website. So now it's time for me to introduce our featured speakers. We have with us today Dr. Marian Wanamaker. Dr. Wanamaker is an assistant professor of economics at UT's Knoxville campus. She grew up in Martin, Tennessee, and escaped the state only to receive her PhD at Northwestern University in Chicago. In 2017-2018, she served on the White House Council of Economic Advisors as senior labor economist and the administration's chief domestic economist. Her expertise is in labor markets, education, and workforce policy. Also with us is Dr. Matthew Murray. Dr. Murray serves as the director of the Howard H. Baker Jr. Center for Public Policy and the associate director of the Boyd Center for Business Economic Research at the University of Tennessee. He has spent more than 25 years of his career forecasting the Tennessee state economy and producing the annual economic report to the governor. And also we have with us Dr. Andrew Muhammad. Dr. Muhammad is a professor of agricultural economics and holds the Blasingame Chair of Excellence in Agricultural Policy at the University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture. Dr. Muhammad focuses on assisting decision makers in the evaluation of opportunities, policies, and programs on international trade. He currently serves on several advisory boards, including the Agricultural Policy Advisory Committee, which provides trade policy counsel to the Secretary of Agriculture and the U.S. Trade Representative. Dr. Muhammad previously served as the Associate Director of the Markets and Trade Economics Division at the Economic Research Service in Washington, D.C., an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And Dr. Muhammad is going to kick things off for us today, so please put your virtual hands together for Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you, John. And so what I'd like to talk to all of us today about is really the implications of COVID-19 on Tennessee's agricultural exports. Right? And oftentimes we don't know how important agricultural exports are to the overall agricultural economy, both at the state level as well as nationally. All right, so for the most part, we tend to export about 20% of agricultural production in the United States. But for the state of Tennessee, heavily reliant on cotton, heavily reliant, say, on forest products, cotton, for example, around 80% of production is for foreign markets. And so in 2018, Tennessee's agricultural exports, both in terms of primary agriculture, consumer-oriented products, as well as what the USDA defines as related goods, was nearly $3 billion. A lot of that was in cotton exports that year, as well as distilled spirits that were one of the leading whiskey exporting states. But something that I think a lot of folks don't realize is we are one of the leading forest product exporting states, as well as we do some things in what's called miscellaneous prepared foods and beverages. And so what have we seen? So we've seen major declines in agricultural exports for the state. First, due to the trade war, because we do rely on China for a lot of export disappearance, but then on top of the trade war, COVID-19. For some reason, this isn't advancing. There we go. Good. All right, my apologies. And so this is just to give you an idea of sort of what happened to Tennessee agricultural exports during the COVID era. And the best way to think about this is to simply compare trade over time with previous periods. And so what I have here is Tennessee's monthly agricultural exports from 2017, as represented by the blue line, all the way up to 2020, as represented by the purple line. And obviously, since we are not yet complete, I can only report the most recent trade data for 2020, which is September 2020. All right, one of the things you see right away is that from March until around July is usually the higher periods for Tennessee agricultural exports, primarily driven by cotton, but also other agricultural commodities. And it's during this period that COVID-19 hit, and you could clearly see how much less exports were during the months following a lot of shutdowns and declines in global demand. And that's only recently sort of reached, trade has recently reached pre-pandemic levels only by July 2020. And what is that sort of, what are the implications? So if we just look at that period up until July, the year-to-date declines have been on average about 3.9% for the United States, but a decline in agricultural exports of about 15% for the state of Tennessee. And where have we seen the most declines? And as mentioned, these declines have primarily been concentrated in Tennessee's exports of cotton, which is around about $112 million loss, which accounts for the bulk of the total loss from that period of January to July. We've also seen some declines, obviously, in forest product exports. This is a joke I often tell, but for some reason, the pandemic caused individuals to drink more. So we actually witnessed a 1% increase in our distilled spirits exports during this period. Now, one would think because of the trade war that where we suffered the most losses would be, say, China, because one, that's where the pandemic started. But one of the things to note is that China in 2020 was coming off such a negative year that even the most mediocre trade year for the United States would have been better than 2019 because of the trade war. But where we've seen some of the biggest declines is our exports to Mexico, down over $1 billion, our exports to Canada, and our exports to India. And so overall, exports have been down for the United States and Tennessee in particular, but not necessarily to the Chinese market. The last thing I'd like to highlight, and this is just to sort of think about things moving forward and to lead into the Q&A later, is that farmers received compensation these last 2 years for 2 things. One, the market facilitation program to compensate farmers for the declines due to the trade war, as well as the coronavirus food assistance programs, which obviously was to support farmers through these most recent depressed periods. That's highlighted in this higher red area, the market facilitation program, this yellow area. The point I want you to see here is how much more agricultural support to farmers has been relative to the last decade, right? And so this administration has really increased its payments to farmers. Now, why is that an issue in terms of trade moving forward? It's because the U.S., we're members of we're a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and as part of that membership And as part of the 1995 WTO agreement, we actually agreed to disciplines on domestic support to agricultural production. And so what the WTO here is defining is what's called amber box policies. And these are policies that distort international markets. And so for the longest, we've been below that limit. And as you can see in the last 2 years, we've exceeded that limit. And right now, the European Union, Brazil, Japan, and a lot of other countries are thinking about a case against the United States. And if successful, they will be allowed to retaliate in some way, which could further depress US trade moving forward. Now, the last thing I'll highlight is something that was on the horizon for 2020 was the fact that China had committed to nearly $40 billion in agricultural purchases in the phase 1 trade agreement between the US and China. And as you could see, as of August, they were nowhere close at 11 billion. The USDA reported through some other means that they felt China was at 71%. I'm not seeing that in the trade data, even data beyond August. However, I mean, the rest of the year still is sort of has yet to be seen. And so with that, I thank you all, and I look forward to your questions, and I invite you to reach out to me if you have questions beyond this program.
Hello, folks. I hope you're all doing well. I'm an economist by training, but I'm going to play public health expert here with you for the next 10 minutes or so. I mentioned before we went live this afternoon that I learned a very important lesson back in March or early April of this year, studying the performance of the economy, and that is ultimately the pandemic is the economy. It's not something we can escape. There were economists back in the spring arguing that we would see a V-shaped economic recovery. This was while we were watching caseload skyrocket in New York. But I'm working with public health folks at UT are telling me this is going to ripple like a wave, like a series of waves across the country. And because our economies are interconnected, we are going to have a long-term problem with the economy. As this is all going on, the Baker Center worked with the group, a series of folks across campus, including folks in the Department of Public Health, to develop this, this response mechanism that we called CORE-19, Coronavirus 19 Outbreak Response Experts. What you're looking at here is part of the homepage. This is an interactive infographic. It's clickable. We update it on a daily basis. It's a very valuable resource tool if you want to follow what's going on across the state of Tennessee. So a very important means to allow people to track what's going on with cases, because cases have a very significant impact on the performance of the economy. The CORE-19 group has done a number of other things as we've gone through the spring, the summer, and now into the fall. We developed models early on that looked at caseloads, projected caseloads, hospitalizations, and deaths for Tennessee counties. We've worked with the governor's office and the Economic Recovery Group to develop a survey, the Tennessee Pulse Survey. We've administered 7 waves of that survey going back to late spring, trying to identify Tennesseans' attitudes towards COVID and the reopening of the economy. All of those surveys are on this website that you're looking at right here. Both the time series and the cross-section version of those surveys, very rich data, very easy to access. We also developed a series of policy briefs, and I'm going to talk to you about a couple of those in the surveys as I get through my remarks here. Our early policy briefs were very basic and elementary because we were still learning. They were about what is COVID? How is it spread? What are personal protection? What is personal protection equipment? How is it used? How effective is it? Can pets contract COVID-19? Does COVID penetrate into wastewater treatment plants, and so on? I did an early brief on state and local government finances that was a bit of a Chicken Little brief, but this was done back in late March, early April, when we really thought the sky was falling. And Fortunately, it turned out not to be the case, in part because federal stimulus put a lot of money in the pockets of people and businesses. That money was spent and that helped prop the economy up, but it also helped prop up sales tax revenues and revenues generally. What I really want to spend the rest of my time talking about is opening of the economy. And it's building on some of the work that I have done and others have done through this Core 19 resource group at the University of Tennessee that remains very, very active. I did a brief back in March trying to inform policymakers in Tennessee about the potential consequences for the economy, but also the consequences of policy actions that would retard the spread of COVID-19 in terms of saving human lives. So the real question I was addressing is this balancing act between letting the economy go or pulling the economy back a little bit. And then what would we save in terms of human lives? It's a very common kind of cost benefit calculus that economists do. Some find it a bit distasteful, but it is, I think, a very important exercise to be able to inform policymakers about this trade-off regarding the economy and human life. The real question is, what is the price society is willing to pay to combat COVID to save lives? Some of the initial numbers, if you remember back to late spring, the numbers were near catastrophic for Tennessee and the nation. In fact, some of the estimates suggested that as many as 100,000 Tennesseans could die if no action was taken to combat COVID-19. It seemed outlandish and crazy at the time. Well, right now we're staring at over 3,600 deaths in Tennessee, with a fair number of steps that have been taken by in terms of policy and individuals to mitigate the spread. Early in this period of COVID's spread across the country and across the state, there was speculation about what this would mean to economic growth in the second quarter of the year. Some of the estimates were in the order of 25 to 35%, and they were pretty close to the mark. The hit to GDP on an annualized basis in the second quarter of the year was about 25 to 30%, about 30% for the US. I think it was 33, in fact. So that was actually part of the price that we paid when the economy suffered through policy actions and the individual actions of workers, consumers, and businesses. So that is a practical hit that the economy incurred. The question is, what might we have saved? What's the value of human life saved through that closure of economic activity? Well, we don't really know. We won't know if we can estimate that number ex post as we get through this pandemic and beyond. So I did basically a hypothetical or a scenario analysis. I used a value of $950,000 as the value of a human life. That's drawn from EPA. It's been updated for inflation. That is an average. I was really quite stunned to receive an email from a financial planner in the Knoxville area who basically told me that's an overstatement of the value of the human life. Said older people aren't worth $953,000. I'll let you ponder that. That's a pretty jarring kind of conclusion. The punchline here in terms of this cost benefit analysis, and by the way, I think I misspoke, it's $9.5 million for a human life. One of the punchlines I did through the scenario analysis is I just looked straight at that roughly 25% hit to state GDP. We didn't have a good number there for the state. I chose 25%. And what my back of the envelope method analysis suggested was that if we saved 10,000 lives in Tennessee, then it was worth incurring that 25% hit to state GDP. I'm going to ask the question because this is teasing you along in my logic here. What caused that reduction in economic activity? I've already said it. We closed the economy down. We closed markets down here in Tennessee to try to combat COVID. Very, very controversial, but that's what we did. I would argue that was a reflection of what Tennesseans wanted. And I would argue that Tennesseans on their own would have effectively closed the economy down because of the risk of contracting COVID and the consequences for life and the consequences for simply being sick. What else would have happened? Well, absent government policy at the state and the local level, Many people would not have gone to work. Many consumers would not have gone to shop. Businesses would have taken steps to limit activity. Households would have changed their behavior. Punchline here is that individual self-interest, either through policy or on individual behavior itself, would have caused the economy to slow down. I want to jump to a policy brief that an undergraduate student prepared for us, two of them, Catherine Folker and Hanson Sale, on herd immunity. If we achieve herd immunity, the economy can fully reopen. Herd immunity ideally can be achieved through a blend of vaccines, contract tracing that allows us to limit exposure, and then therapeutics to mitigate the consequences for those who get sick. That is not really the way herd immunity has been characterized because we don't have a vaccine in this country. An extensive share of the population would need to be infected in order to yield herd immunity, anywhere from 60% to 80%, depending in part on the infection fatality rate of, in this case, COVID-19. If that infection fatality rate is relatively low, then you don't need to have as many individuals protected from COVID-19, ultimately infected or through a vaccine protected. But even a low infection fatality rate of 0.2% would imply 8,300 deaths in Tennessee. That gets us close to that 25% price tag in terms of GDP. However, we think that, and I say we, public health specialists think that the infection fatality rate is much higher than that. Working with a number of 1%, which some would argue is still relatively low, would translate into over 41,000 deaths in Tennessee. We're starting to approach the full level of GDP for our state economy. We would end up with about 4 million infections in Tennessee, in addition to deaths. Understand that sickness itself is very, very costly. Even those that don't die from COVID oftentimes are sick for a prolonged period of time. Even if they get over COVID quickly, they may have missed work which has consequences for household income and for economic performance. I don't think Tennesseans, I don't think policymakers would be willing to accept the herd immunity path, particularly absent vaccines. Look at the actions of Republican governor of Ohio today. They are going to begin to effectively enforce the mask mandate that they have present in that state. Now, I urge you to take a look at the COVID-19 site that you're looking at right there, and you can click through and so on. But I want to move to a couple of key findings that relate to the remarks I've made already from the Tennessee Pulse survey. And I'm having the same problem here that Andrew had. How do I click through this? There we go. We ask a series of questions about your engagement with society, with the market. Do you go to church? Do you go to movies? Do you go to large events? I want to draw your attention to the right-hand side. And what you'll see is around 15 to 20% never go to a restaurant. Or almost never go to a restaurant. Add those two together, then you add the sometimes together, you're looking at a very significant share of Tennesseans who almost never or never go to a restaurant or just sometimes go to a restaurant. This is driven in part by COVID-19 and its spread and the risk of going to a restaurant. There was a study that was released just yesterday saying, actually it was updated yesterday, saying that restaurants and cafes were one of the top sources of contracting COVID-19. All right, so if a lot of people aren't going to go out and go to a restaurant, what will get them to go out? Again, I draw your attention to the right-hand side. A significant share, 15 to 20%, pretty consistent across the waves of the survey, are not going to go out to a restaurant until a vaccine is available. Skip down a panel to when the number of cases is steadily going down. That is a very significant share of the population. They're not going to go out until a vaccine's available and/or cases are going down. Now, there is this other group. I am comfortable doing this activity now near the bottom. That's roughly a third of Tennesseans. So we've got a significant share of Tennesseans who are more than happy today and going out to movie theaters if they're open, or sporting events, or to church. But we have this other group that is not willing to do so, and they won't do so until a vaccine is available and/or cases are going down. In other words, restaurant performance is not going to improve until we are fundamentally able to deal with the spread of COVID-19. This was a really stunning finding. We're asking whether or not you are supportive of a local mask mandate within your own communities, not a state mandate, a local mask mandate. And the numbers here are really quite striking. If you look at the 89 counties in Tennessee, you look at the 6 counties that have independent public health authority, those counties, the numbers are closer to 80 to 82% on those that want a mask mandate. If you go to the other 89 counties, you still find well over half, in fact, about 2/3 that support a mask mandate. And yet those same communities are not enabled by the state to put those in play. Lastly, this is actually a pretty disturbing graphic. We added this question late. It first appeared in wave 4. The top panel shows you those that would definitely get the vaccine. And note that the number has been trending down, now down to just over 1/3 of Tennesseans who would definitely get the vaccine. The number probably getting the vaccine is inched up a little bit, but that's just a little over half of our state. The problem there is we need to have more people vaccinated in order to get closer to herd immunity that would ultimately enable us to reopen the economy. The big punchline here as I wrap things up is that the economy and public health are inextricably interwoven. They cannot be separated. There is ongoing talk about let's open up the economy, let's open it up. The problem is neither the public nor policymakers, I think, are willing to accept that. So we need to practice social distancing. We need to wear masks. We need to be very, very careful. Ultimately, when the vaccine becomes available, we need to take it. We need to jawbone friends, family, and others to take it as well. And then ultimately, by summer of next year, let's hope and let's pray that we are crawling out of the deep hole created by the pandemic. So those are my remarks. I will pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Wanamaker.
All right, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Andrew. I'm realizing I should talk to my colleagues more because I've learned a lot this morning from the 2 of them, or this afternoon from the 2 of them already. I'm going to talk to you about the labor market. So I don't know anything about trade, and I know very little about epidemiology, but I know a lot about jobs. And so let me just start off by trying to put our current situation in context. So I graduated from college in the 01 recession. I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to a person. Then I watched our students graduate in the 07, 08, 09 recession. I thought, well, maybe that was the worst thing that could happen to someone. And then my students, of course, who graduated in May really have had it the worst of all of those groups, right? This is a really outstanding labor market contraction. And let me just show you the numbers that will put that into context. So first, I'm going to just show you, this is a graph that labor economists have looked at 80 million times. So let me try to just show you what's going on here. So this is every recession in the United States from World War II through the 08-09 financial crisis. And for each recession, what this chart is doing is just starting at 0 on the eve of the recession, and then it's just following the change in employment, okay, or jobs in the economy over time. And so you can see that the first recessions starting in 1948 and going through 1990 recession, all of those recessions were relatively short-lived. We had a deep contraction, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4% of jobs were lost. And then by the time we got to about 18, 20, 24 months after the recession began, those jobs had recovered. The 01 recession was pretty shallow. We lost only 2% of jobs, but it took us 46 months to get back to 0. Okay, so it was shallow but long. The 08-09 financial crisis was the deepest and most protracted jobs crisis in American history. Again, all of this is in percentage terms, right? So we're controlling for the size of the economy, but it's still true that in 08 and 09, because we lost about 6% of jobs over 2 years, it took us an extraordinarily long time to recover. So you had to go about 6 years from the beginning of that recession to get back to 0. And we really did, economists really thought this was the worst it could be. It couldn't be any worse than what happened in 08-09. And then COVID hit. Okay, notice that we've had to totally change the scale of this thing, right? So the jobs losses that we experienced in March and April of this year are, I know you're tired of hearing this word, but they are unprecedented. A 14%, more than 14% contraction in jobs. And then where we are today, even though we have sort of half recovered already, where we are today is still worse than where we were at the bottom of the 08-09 drop. So yes, we're in much better shape than we were in April, but we remain in a really precarious job situation. As I said, the United States in general has recovered about half of what we lost. So in raw terms, we lost 22 million jobs in March and April. 11 million of those are back. And so 11 million people who had a job in February still don't have a job. In Tennessee, we're doing a little bit better than that. So the way I have plotted the data in this figure, you can compare apples to apples. I'm indexing everything to where we were in February. And you can see that Tennessee's decline in percentage terms was less than for the United States as a whole. And we've recovered more jobs. So Tennessee lost about 400,000 jobs in 2 months, and about 250,000 of those are back. So 150,000 Tennesseans who had a job in February still do not, as of today, have a job. That is 5% of total employment in February. The United States still lacks 7% of employment that we had in February. It has yet to return. I love this figure because it gives you a sense of what this looks like by industry. So in the chat at the beginning, when John asked, what industry are you in? I saw lots of government workers in there. And the government's kind of in the middle of the pack here, all right? So we are still about 4% below where we were in February if you're in the government sector. The US as a whole, as I said, is about 7% below, and then you can see how this shakes out across industries. The financial industry has done really well. That's real estate and banking. Okay, so if any of you are in real estate or banking, you know that you've been extraordinarily busy since February, and so these numbers won't surprise you. Retail trade, I think if you had asked us in February what we thought would happen to retail trade, I think we would have predicted something much worse than 3% job loss. So that has been a relatively resilient industry. Healthcare has lost jobs because people are not going in for routine care. Hospitals are busy and run over, but outpatient facilities are not. Trade, transport, and utilities, government and manufacturing and construction are kind of all in this same bucket of sort of medium-sized losses. Looking at the very bottom of the list, this won't surprise you. The biggest job losses are in leisure and hospitality. We're still 3.8 million jobs down in leisure and hospitality. Another huge job loss sector is mining and logging, which includes oil and gas extraction. So I don't know if you remember the moment in the pandemic when gas had a negative price for a few days. So people's consumption of gasoline has just plummeted. And so people who work in oil and gas extraction have really experienced a significant job loss. The trick is that's not a very big industry. So that's only about 101,000 jobs relative to where we were in February. One thing that is very clear in this recession and is clear in most recessions is that bachelor's degrees really do protect against job loss. So here's my, rah-rah UT moment, that it really is the case that you don't want to be a non-college graduate in a recession. So these are numbers from the Washington Post, but they're relying on government data to produce this pretty figure. And it shows you that if you have a bachelor's degree, relative to February, only about 2% of those individuals do not have a job. If you're a some college, high school diploma, or less than a high school diploma, those groups are all sort of in the same boat. Employment losses are on the order of 8% for all three of those groups. So it really is binary. You either have a college degree or you don't in terms of what your situation is in the current pandemic. The high school diploma and less than a high school diploma groups obviously saw much deeper trough in March and April. But if you take a snapshot right now, again, they're only about 8% down relative to where they started. One of the more sobering things about this pandemic, for me anyway, as a working mother, has been the loss of jobs for women. So I remember in December and January of 2019 and 2020, there was a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere really trumpeting the fact that women for the first time held more jobs in the United States than men did. And it was like 50.01% versus 49.99%. We had just gotten there for the very first time in history. There was lots of celebration about that. And then COVID-19 happened. And so what happened in March and April was, because women are disproportionately employed in retail and in leisure and hospitality, women lost more jobs in March and April than men did. That's the initial decline here that you see all the way to this initial trough. Then women recovered. So as the economy reopened, so to speak, and retail in particular returned, women got back to parity with men. And so if you looked in June or July, you would have breathed a sigh of relief and said, all right, we're good. No worries, that was temporary. And then what happened in August and September is that the failure of schools to reopen across the country, not necessarily in Tennessee, although there are places in Tennessee where that has been true, but across the country, the general failure of schools to reopen, especially in the biggest cities, has led women to leave the labor market, even if they have employment. And so you can see the gap emerge again in August and September of this year. There are similar dynamics when you look at the labor market by race. So I'm giving you a long run view here. This is starting sort of from the beginning of the 08-09 recession. You can see that Black and African Americans have gained labor force participation relative to whites over time. Recessions are always like this. They tend to hit minority groups harder. And then as we recover from a recession, minority groups tend to gain and get closer to parity. So that's what happened as we left the 08-09 recession. And then once again, much like women, the initial shock in March and April really affected minority groups more than it did white Americans. And so you see a bigger decline in labor force participation for Blacks than you do for whites. There was some recovery in that this summer. Both groups tended to get back to work in the summer. And then once again, August and September have been bad news. And there's the evidence about why is not quite as clear as it is for women, but there's lots of at least anecdotal evidence that this decline in Black labor force participation in August and September is again related to schools. That people are struggling to figure out what to do with their kids if they're not in school. And so their solution is to leave the labor market and stay at home. Finally, just kind of on the data side, I want to say that as Matt says, we can't escape the pandemic. The pandemic is in charge here. And so one of the things that's happened just in the last few weeks, last few days even, is that some of the more promising signs we were seeing in leisure and hospitality have started to reverse. So on the left-hand side, you have reservations for restaurant meals. And on the right-hand side, you have the number of check-ins that TSA agents are processing at airports. So restaurants and airports, right? Both of those activities plummet in March and April. You can see that here. And then they've been on a pretty steady recovery since then. You can see these dips, a couple of dips here. This big jump and this big jump are related to summer activities, people really kind of getting back to normal. And then I don't know if you remember the July and August resurgence of the virus, but that explains these declines. And you're starting to see these patterns turn around yet again. So restaurant activity has really fallen off in the last few weeks, and TSA activities at the airport have also fallen off in the last few weeks. So if the virus is in charge, this is exactly what you would have expected to see given our rising case count. So I just want to say a little bit about what, I think about this from a policy perspective. What could the White House be doing? What could Congress be doing? And so I would say a few things about what we should expect Congress to be thinking about in the next few weeks as we bridge a lame duck president and think about, changing administrations in January. So the first thing is, and I think there's bipartisan agreement on this, is the virus does have to be under control to make much progress. It will minimize the amount of churn in the labor market if people don't have to leave their old employer and go find a new employer, because of these ongoing issues. The second thing, and Matt mentioned this earlier, the second thing that Congress is thinking about is, okay, in the short run, we can't make the virus fully go away and we can't get everybody back to work. So, but what we need to do is we need to somehow make household incomes whole until we can get to that point. We did a really, really good job of that in April, extraordinarily good job of that. Congress threw money at households and households took it and spent it. And so we survived the initial shock much better than we otherwise would have. Now that the pace of things is a little bit slower, Congress can do a more targeted Band-Aid on household income. Instead of sending every American $1,200, they can send only some Americans $1,200, or they can target unemployment insurance at people who need it the most. There are ways to keep Americans from feeling all of the brunt of the household income losses, and I expect Congress to do something along those lines. The payroll protection program was another thing that Congress did in March and April that, again, I think is extraordinarily successful, but small businesses are not out of the woods and they're going to need more help. Some small businesses are going to need government support to bridge to late 2021 before they really are fully back online. And that's important because 50% of American workers are employed by small businesses. So the success of small businesses dictates the success of our overall labor market. In a survey commissioned by the Census Bureau, 10% of small businesses laid off workers in the first 12 days of October. The job shedding in small businesses is ongoing, and stopping that job shedding would allow the labor market to perform better. Finally, I'll say that I think it's really important that Congress and this administration really think about school reopenings. What can we do right now for the next few weeks that would encourage schools nationwide to reopen? Knox County has reopened, but of course there are parts of the state where that's not true. What would it take? What do they need in terms of federal support to do so? It's not necessarily monetary. What a lot of people would tell, what a lot of administrators in these locations would say is, it's not the money. We need some access to testing, for example, so that our faculty feel safe being in the building. And so there are ways in which the federal government can intervene on that front as well. Okay, so we're going to quickly go through our takeaways, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So takeaway from what I just told you is that the labor market has, as I said, half recovered. And a full recovery is probably not possible as long as the virus rages. Job losses and that recovery have not affected all demographic groups equally. And Washington does have tools to help us manage this virus through to the end, which is hopefully late 2021. And the question is whether they can kind of get it together up there to use them. And then Matt, I'll let you chime in on yours.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I think I used these very words at the end of my remarks. Public health and the economy are inextricably linked. In order to fully open the economy, we have got to do more to combat the COVID-19 epidemic. And in the meantime, before a vaccine is fully distributed to the American population, we need to engage in safe practices, wear a mask, social distancing, stay away from large crowds, indoor activities, and so on. That means, potentially unpleasant Thanksgiving and Christmas for many of us, particularly those that have older members of a family or a friend network.
Andrew, I think you're muted. There you go.
Man, it's amazing that space button trick only works when you don't want it to work. But all right, so so it looks like things are recovering for Tennessee agricultural exports. I think the two things to sort of think about, that's our reliance on China. And because of that, that's actually been a positive because of all the countries around the world. Economic forecasts are forecasting China to be the only large country with positive economic growth in 2020. Right. And so as manufacturing steps up in that country, it increases their demand for cotton and other primary agricultural products and forestry products. And so therefore, we've been seeing this increase in Tennessee exports. Now, here's the thing I'd say sort of caution us. I did mention sort of some issues we may have with the WTO, the World Trade Organization moving forward, but we have yet to see China's ability to really satisfy the phase one trade agreement. That's going to say a lot about whether or not exports will sort of not just recover, but go beyond the recovery. And then one, as we think about a new administration and its engagement with China, one could even imagine sort of China and the US sort of sitting down again and rethinking sort of how they engage moving forward.
Okay, I think, and so John, I think you're curating Q&A.
Yep, thank you, everybody. And we've already got a question for Dr. Muhammad in the chat. Did we get to stockpile the unsold agricultural products, or were they wasted?
Well, it depends, right? So you do get instances in the news of seeing dairy farmers literally just sort of dump milk in fields. A lot of that had to do more with domestic supply chain issues. The mere fact that certain supply chains are meant for the food service industry versus grocery stores, and you can't really easily translate into, say, commercial production or say dairy products and meat products versus production for retail outlets like grocery stores. So in that sense, some agricultural commodities got wasted. Obviously, storable commodities like soybeans and corn, we've seen sort of a buildup in stocks. But then when you get a case like forestry, where I guess the land itself is its storage, yes, there was a sort of technically a buildup, one could say. However, we still had sawmills and logging companies go out of business due to the inactivity just during that period, on top of the negative impacts of the trade war that really hit U.S. agriculture and Tennessee agriculture in particular.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Would anybody like to unmute yourself and ask a question to the panel?
John, I'm going to jump right in here because I want to kind of get to the end of this, if you will, and that is, when do things really turn around? And so I want to use this alphabet soup analogy that began back in spring. And I think the initial default on the part of economists, we were going to have a V-shaped recovery. My gut was telling me we were going to have a Nike swoosh recovery, maybe even a bit of a W in there. Since then, people have used the square root symbol. A month ago, I saw folks referring to a K. This has real important implications for when economic activity is restored. And the evidence would suggest it depends on the measure. So I'd like to ask Dr. Muhammad and Dr. Wanamaker what they think. When will agricultural exports return to pre-COVID levels? And Dr. Wanamaker, when will GDP and when will employment return to pre-COVID levels?
All right, so I'll start with agriculture. The first thing to note is that even though we did see declines in sales in terms of food service industries, the decline in food demand was not as severe. And in fact, you had a period of individuals and households stockpiling food. So you even saw a slight increase. So overall agricultural food demand has been relatively solid because regardless of circumstances and even with income loss, there still is this need for subsistence and a certain amount of food, right? And so we hadn't reached a stage economically where people are necessarily eating less, even though they're not eating out as much. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'll say is that whatever has taken place in Southeast Asia, this short time period of inactivity has led to a certain degree of buildup. And so we are seeing some huge increases in expected sales, say, for example, of soybeans to China in particular. One of the reasons why we're now seeing at least some increases in agricultural commodity prices above the pre-COVID losses. And a lot of those prices even went into the positive range, even before the government announced the second coronavirus food assistance program. So in terms of agricultural exports, USDA is even forecasting for FY 2021 then an increase of about $5 billion in total, not a lot, but certainly more than 2020, the fiscal year 1920, And overall, they do see agricultural exports increasing moving forward. And a lot of that has to do with increased demand in Asian markets.
I'll just say a word about the labor market recovery. So it's not a traditional recession, okay? But economists don't really have a way of thinking about labor market recoveries other than using previous recessions to guide us. So let me just tell you what you would know if you looked at previous recessions, is that after the economy recovers fully, so after we go back to producing everything we were producing before the recession started, it takes an extra 12 months to employ all of the people we were employing before the recession started. So the simple way of thinking about this, for me anyway, is if we're all back to normal sometime in late next year, which is what I anticipate. So sometime in fall 2021, we return to normalcy. That means employment will be back to its pre-pandemic levels in roughly the middle to end of 2022. And that, I don't see any reason to expect anything different from that. That's not a huge, that's not a terribly long recession. And I think if we got to that, that'd be a very fortunate outcome.
So I'll just comment, that just to clarify what what Dr. Wanamaker just said, that gets employment back to where it was before this hit. That means we have gone that long window of time with no net gain in employment. So my final comment here is about the K-shaped expansion or K-shaped recovery. The letter K doesn't clearly convey this, but they're really winners and losers. So that part of the K that goes up to that, kind of to the upper right when you draw that K, that is the recovery for those that are re-engaged with the economy. But that other part of the K goes down to the right. And that is a group that is going to suffer for quite a long period of time. That includes those individuals that are displaced over the period of time that Dr. Wanamaker mentioned, and also those individuals who were not able to get jobs during this intervening period of time from COVID crash to a full recovery. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you all. Another question in the chat here. Will sales tax revenues stay strong, or will there be a decline if there is no additional federal stimulus?
Well, I don't think there will be a decline, but I would expect very, very weak growth, if growth at all. If you look at the data, sales tax revenue did very, very well in the spring and second quarter, and all the evidence now suggests it's continuing to do well. And that's because in part of those very large stimulus checks that went to households and went to the unemployed. That's fading. Now, much of that is gone, and it's going to continue to fade. And by the beginning of 2021, it will be completely gone, or nearly so. So it's going to certainly put downward pressure on sales tax collections. Whether we actually see negative year over year, it's possible, but it's a pretty pessimistic scenario for the sales tax. The good news is the property tax at the local level is relatively stable. Property tax revenues, the base is determined by historical property values. Those are not likely to be hit hard. Commercial property might be, but this is all going to transpire with a lag. So the real key for local governments, but as well the state, is the sales tax. And I just don't expect it to perform the way it did over the course of the spring because of the lack of stimulus and the prolonged loss of jobs and income.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. And then there's a question directly for you in the chat. It seems that when you last surveyed if people would take the vaccine was about the time there was some negative news on the vaccine. With the current positive stories, do you project a significant change in the response, leaning a more positive interest to be vaccinated?
Yes, I do. I think there's really only one direction for it to go, and that's up. And the stories we're hearing now about the Pfizer drug and others, and folks that are coming forward now who have actually taken the vaccine. I saw a story the other day. A gentleman said it felt like a bad hangover. I think a lot of people would be willing to experience a bad hangover in order to save their lives and save the lives of those around them. And I think that we're going to see a continued uptick. But I still think we're going to see this pretty rock solid group of 20 or 25% of the population. They're not going to take it. It's ongoing distrust of vaccines, compounded by some of the negative coverage of COVID and vaccines.
Thank you. And Nick asks, living through this, what policy safeguards would you all recommend for future pandemics?
Well, I'll start, and this wouldn't necessarily be a policy safeguard, but just sort of the government's role in the development of I wouldn't call it a new sector, but the ways in which we purchase food moving forward. And you think about the fact that a lot of what we do now is electronic and online. And as we think about food safety issues, and as we think about other regulatory issues as it relates to the food supply chain, how that translates into electronic purchases in e-commerce is something to think about moving forward. Because one could imagine during pandemics, this need to purchase from home. And we've seen a lot of that increase, but how that gets regulated and monitored moving forward is something very important.
I'll chime in on the labor market side. So I think one of the lessons from the pandemic has been that our system of getting unemployment insurance benefits to people in this country is broken. If you know somebody who lost their job in March or April and tried to file for unemployment in Tennessee or elsewhere, you will know just how painful and frustrating and prolonged that process was. We helped a friend of ours go through that process, and it took 8 weeks to get the first check for a family who lives at subsistence level. And so from just a pure kind of government spending perspective, the power of that dollar depreciates if it takes you 8 weeks to get it to somebody. They're going to, if you can get it to them tomorrow, they will spend it on high value things. If you get it to them 8 weeks later, they may have a job already and not need it and not spend it in a way that they otherwise would have. So it destroys the power of the stimulus if you can't get it to people quickly. So I anticipate that when the dust settles, one of the things we will be talking about is how do we put together a better infrastructure for getting payments to people and to small businesses, because I think in the future we're going to see stimulus payments directly to small businesses. How can we do that without all the red tape that we went through this go around? And I think it's going to be, for policy wonks, it's going to be fascinating to watch states try to manage that.
And if I would just add, since I'm pretending to be a public health expert this afternoon, we need better federal coordination. We still have PPE problems. I mean, I'm dumbfounded. My wife works at a local hospital. They are still having PPE problems today, and things are just starting to escalate. And I'm just beside myself. I can't believe that we are this far out from March and we are still having a shortage. So we need better federal government coordination. And that's for PPE, but that's for contact tracing and so on, so that if something like this happens again, we can do a better job of limping through it than we have over the course of the last 8 months.
Thank you all. And let's see. Laura Russ asked, would you all personally take the vaccine? How will we know the long-term effects?
I'll chime in. I mean, you shouldn't take our opinions about whether we will take the vaccine as being anything other than just our opinions. But yes, my family will take the vaccine, despite the fact that I don't want to, but I will, okay, because I know, it's a free rider problem. If everybody makes the decision not to take it, relying on their neighbors and friends to take it, right, then we end up in a really bad situation. So it's a public benefit to take the vaccine, and so I will. Also because I imagine UT will mandate it. And in terms of how do we know if it works, it's a great question. I mean, the data that came out of Pfizer actually, and maybe Matt's the public health expert here, so maybe he'll disagree with me. But the data that came out of Pfizer was actually on a quite small sample. If you think about the number of infections that they were actually tracking, it wasn't that many. But the trick is that there are so many vaccines in trial, right? That you're going to multiply that sample size times 5, 10, 15, however many vaccine producers there eventually will be. And by then you're going to have a ton of evidence about how effective it is. So I actually don't think in the end it'll be all that ambiguous about whether this is a quote unquote good vaccine, or if we have a flu vaccine style, which is not a great vaccine because it has such low coverage rates.
Thank you. Carolyn asked, can storefront retail survive?
Well, storefront retail was dying before this, and COVID will expedite some of the changes to storefront retail. I think people still want the storefront experience. I don't think it's going to completely go away. We still like to go out and engage in shopping. We'd like to see it. We like to touch it. But we're going to continue to see this ongoing migration away from retail to online, and COVID sped that process up. And it probably, a lot of people who weren't fully engaged in online buying probably found, hey, this is pretty easy. And I decided, look, I'd rather order dog food and cat food online than go out to the pet store every 3 or 4 weeks. It's just easier. I don't have to pay shipping, pay sales tax, which is good. And by the way, sales tax is coming in on the vast majority of the internet purchases that Tennesseans are making. That's a really important point to make. Those online purchases were generating sales tax revenue for the state in most instances.
And Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would not have been true 3 years ago. That's new.
Correct.
That's a new Supreme Court decision that made it such that the state of Tennessee collects that.
Yeah, that's correct. We were still getting it from a significant share, but the Wayfair decision, yeah, it made it a lot easier. And then we saw just in mass, the retailers all come online to the system and then collect the sales tax on our behalf.
We got lucky.
Pamela asks, Dr. Wanamaker, do you see any changes in the labor market and job demands in specific industries or an increase in work from home employment?
Great question. So, you know, there's not a ton of evidence yet on the change in the specific skill mix of American employment. We don't have great data on what's in demand at the moment, other than to say that, you know, web development skills are in demand, as they always are, but even more so now because everybody's updating their website, right? So, and trying to change their processes and protocols. And so you talk almost any kind of business that has any tech presence at all will tell you that they are having to update things in real time over the last 6 months. So that's obviously one area that's really important. An increase in work from home employment. Look, it's been said a million times, but it bears repeating. Work from home worked well because we all had spent years in the office together before we got sent home. Work from home does not work well when you're onboarding new workers into your organization. Any UT grad from May who is working from home will tell you that it is miserable. They're not getting the training, they're not getting the mentoring, they're not picking up the kind of informal training that they would get just, you know, talking to somebody over coffee in the office. There's a ton of knowledge sharing that happens in those informal settings, and those things are not happening. And so, yes, we can Band-Aid for a little while and all work from home, but it's not a permanent arrangement. It's not going to work. Do I expect that people will work from home more than they did in the past when we all go back to normal? Yes, for sure. It'll be a job perk. You'll get to stay home 1 or 2 days a week. But the idea that we're going to disband our offices, close them down, and all move home is silliness. It's not going to happen.
Thank you. Any other questions for our panel? Pamela says that's good for commercial real estate.
Yeah, I was going to say it is. I mean, there will still, I anticipate, Matt can weigh in, I anticipate there will still be a decline in demand for commercial real estate. You know, even if people stay home 2 days a week, that still means that you have office sharing opportunities that you did not have before, and you'll reduce your footprint. So there still will be a negative impact, but it's not going to be the total doomsday scenario that people were suggesting. And even if you talk to people in New York who are in the real estate industry in New York, they'll say the same thing. They'll say next year's going to stink, but it's eventually going to get back to something much closer to normal than we originally feared.
Any final questions for our panel? Going once, going twice. I think that's everybody. Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Murray, Dr. Wanamaker, thank you all so very much for being with us today. We really appreciate all the wisdom and insight you shared. And thank you all to our attendees who came to us and got to pick up some great information today. So hopefully we'll see you for some more webinars, but thank you again for your time today. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, team.
Thank you all. And this recording will be available. We'll send that out to everybody who registered. So we'll see you all at the next one. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.